I'm a nature lover, even though nature can have its dangers. It's good decompression for me and recharges my batteries. You get into a certain kind of zen on a tractor mowing. And also, when you're mowing, you get to see a lot of nature. The bluebirds don't care if you're mowing. In fact, the red-tailed hawks are somewhat attracted. I returned to Westchester County to go into private practice because that's where I went to med school. When I first went into practice, I was just doing general medicine, so I would randomly see occasional patients like any internist would, right? But then around 1988, the local library in Armonk was about to undergo a building campaign. It was a fairly small library. They were trying to raise funds and do a fundraising campaign, and they asked me if I would set up a series of medical lectures. And since I was seeing these patients with this puzzling new entity, Lyme disease, and it was fascinating, I decided that I would give a talk on Lyme disease. And in the course of preparing for that talk, I spent about 3 months using the medical library at Northern Westchester, and with the help of the medical librarian, went through, I can't say all, but a lot of the literature that was available then in 1988, which actually wasn't that much. You could spend a couple of months and you would be pretty up to speed, you know. So I gave this talk. It was in the basement of the little Armonk library at the time, because they hadn't yet done their renovations. It was like this basement floor with linoleum, and but there was a lot of interest in Lyme at that point, and a lot of people were getting sick. So that basement was like jam-packed. There must have been 300 people crammed into this in the basement of the library. So I gave my talk on Lyme disease, and as I've said in other venues, I was an instant expert. Okay, but I knew I wasn't an expert, but I knew more than anybody else, in any of the other physicians in the area, because I'd reviewed the literature. 15 years ago, we decided to get some chickens. My wife did some research, and there were certain kinds of chickens that were friendly chickens, because some chickens can be mean. But then we had a problem, that there were a lot of red-tailed hawks, like I was just saying. No, another name for red-tailed hawk? Chicken hawks. So we thought that, well, gee, maybe we'll get some goats, thinking that the goats would protect the chickens. Wrong. Goats are not Doberman pinschers. That's how we ended up with goats. No longer have any chickens, and then we turned the chicken coop into this really ritzy goat house. Vicki Logan came to me late 80s, maybe 89 or so, and at that time she had already been sick for several years. She had developed a gait disturbance where she was dragging her foot, and a bunch of other neurologic problems, and she had had multiple spinal taps, and people had found that she had what's called a chronic meningitis. I studied her for about a year, very carefully, using every test I could think of for Lyme disease and also for other entities, and finally, around 1990, I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. I had not proven a diagnosis of Lyme, but I also felt it was not possible to exclude it. So I admitted her to my hospital, Northern Westchester, performed a spinal tap, treated her with 3 weeks of intravenous cefotaxime. That was one of the best, and still one of the best intravenous antibiotics for the treatment of Lyme disease. She contacted me in the fall of '91 and begged me for another spinal tap. So you can imagine how desperate a person must be to beg for a spinal tap, right? Well, a couple of weeks later, I got a very excited telephone call from David Dennis from CDC Fort Collins, letting me know that there were spirochetes that were growing in her spinal fluid. It was so unbelievable to him, and somewhat understandably, that it could survive that intensity and duration of treatment. Just around that time, I got called on the carpet by my chief of staff. I've told this story a bunch of times. He was an infectious diseases physician, and it was clear that he was getting ready to sanction me. He accused me of being obsessed with Lyme disease. And just around that, just a few days before, I had received the pathology report from Paul DeRay at the National Institutes of Health. He was at the NIH Clinical Center, which showed spirochetes in the pericardium. And I told this guy, who was my chief, that there were spirochetes in the pericardium, and he said, "Oh, this is a complicated case," and he backed off. But it was clear he was getting ready to sanction me.
I met Ken a couple years ago at an ILADS conference, but I had read his book and I had been following his work. And what happened is Dr. Liegner said one of the biggest problems are these ICD codes, these drop-down menus and these medical codes. When you try to identify and put in information about Lyme disease, it gives a very limited response. It basically only identifies the acute early form of the disease. So I said, if we can change the codes, the chances are we will change access to care and diagnosis and reimbursement for millions of people across the globe. Our dialogue helped to discover a pathway forward. It's the first time since the epidemic began that the only global public health institution that represents all the governments in the world has validated 5 potentially life-threatening complications from the disease. So it would not have happened if we had not been in a conversation. Secondly, yes, he absolutely used his decade-long presence in this advocacy field to bring in some incredibly important people. Third, his testimony to the special rapporteur was very, very relevant and critical. He used the case study of Vicki Logan, and Vicki Logan basically died from, medical execution.
I think it's still very much I think progress is being made, but it's still somewhat dispiriting to see still how much resistance there is. The battle's not over. It's a battle ongoing. I think progress is being made, but there's still tremendous resistance, and there's still a lot of work to be done, both scientifically and also politically. There's a lot of work to be done.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.